78-year-old Harold Mitchell donated his entire apple harvest to the struggling Pinecrest Veterans Shelter, despite facing imminent foreclosure on his family's century-old Hillcrest farm. 3 weeks later, with property tax notices piling up and winter approaching, Harold awoke to the rumble of trucks coming up his driveway and discovered that Sergeant Marcus Coleman, the quiet man who had accepted his donation, was actually a master builder whose grandfather had once served alongside Harold's father in the Korean War, a connection that would transform both their lives in ways neither could have imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Harold Mitchell's gnarled fingers moved methodically through the apple tree branches, his touch gentle yet precise as he selected only the ripest fruit. At 78, Harold's face resembled the topography of the land he'd worked for over 6 decades. Deep furrows around his eyes from squinting into countless sunrises, laugh lines etched by years of simple pleasures, and a perpetual weathered tan that no winter ever fully erased. The crisp October air carried the sweet scent of apples and the first hint of approaching frost as he worked, filling his 3rd basket of the morning. "That should do it, buddy," he murmured to the aging golden retriever watching faithfully from beneath the tree. The dog's tail thumped against the ground, gray muzzle lifted toward his master with unwavering devotion. The Mitchell family orchard stretched across the eastern slope of Hillcrest Farm. 63 trees in neat rows, each one planted by Harold's father, Thomas, upon returning from the Korean War in 1953. The trees had provided steady income through difficult times, their fruit renowned throughout Lakeside County for its exceptional sweetness. But this year's harvest would not be going to the farmer's market or local grocers as it had for decades. From the crest of the hill, Harold heard the familiar sound of tires on gravel. He straightened slowly, one hand pressed against his lower back, the other shading his eyes against the morning sun. His daughter's blue sedan appeared around the bend in the long driveway, right on schedule for her Sunday visit. "Should have known we'd find you in the orchard," Grace called as she stepped from the car. At 52, she carried herself with the confident efficiency of the hospital administrator she'd become, her practical bob and sensible clothes reflecting her no-nonsense approach to life. Behind her, Harold's 16-year-old grandson, Ethan, emerged reluctantly from the passenger seat, eyes still fixed on his phone. The boy had his grandmother's gentle features, though he'd never known Evelyn, who had passed before his birth. "Harvest won't gather itself," Harold replied, setting down his basket. "Good to see you both." Grace embraced her father, noting with concern how his frame seemed frailer than during her visit just 2 weeks prior. "Dad, you shouldn't be out here alone with the ladder. What if you fell?" "Been climbing these trees since before you were born," Harold countered with a dismissive wave. "Buddy would go for help, wouldn't you, boy?" The dog wagged his tail at the mention of his name, causing Ethan to finally look up from his phone. "Hey, Gramps," he said, kneeling to greet Buddy with more enthusiasm than he'd shown his grandfather. "Hey, old buddy." They walked together toward the 2-story farmhouse that had sheltered 4 generations of Mitchells. Its white clapboard siding needed fresh paint, and the green shutters hung slightly askew on the upper windows. But to Harold, it remained the center of his world. Inside, the home smelled of cinnamon and apples from the pie he'd baked that morning, a skill Evelyn had insisted he learn during their 52 years of marriage. "You've been baking again," Grace observed, her tone softening as she recognized her mother's recipe. "Thought the boy might appreciate something sweet," Harold said, glancing at Ethan, who had already claimed his usual spot at the kitchen table, though his attention remained on his phone. The kitchen, with its original pine floors and hand-built cabinets, had changed little since Harold's childhood. The modern refrigerator and stove looked almost apologetic among the vintage surroundings. On the walls hung the visual history of Hillcrest Farm. Harold as a boy helping his father with the first apple harvest. Evelyn standing proudly beside their award-winning corn display at the 1976 County Fair. Harold's parents on their wedding. A day in 1946, and most prominently, a faded photograph of Harold's grandfather breaking ground for the farmhouse in 1922. As Grace prepared coffee, Harold sliced the still warm pie, setting a generous portion before his grandson. "Try that, son. Apples picked just yesterday." Ethan finally set his phone aside, the aroma too tempting to ignore. "Thanks, Gramps," he said, taking a bite that momentarily transformed his teenage indifference into genuine appreciation. "This is amazing." Harold nodded, satisfied, and sat heavily in his chair at the head of the table. The simple oak piece had witnessed countless family meals, discussions, arguments, and reconciliations through 10 decades of Mitchell family life. "So," Grace began tentatively, "have you given any more thought to what we discussed last time?" Harold's expression closed like a shutter. He knew exactly what his daughter was referring to. Her increasingly urgent suggestions that he sell Hillcrest Farm and move into the senior living community in Riverdale. "Farm's not for sale," he said simply, cutting into his own slice of pie with more force than necessary. Grace exchanged a glance with Ethan, who suddenly found renewed interest in his phone. "Dad, be reasonable. This place is too much for you to manage alone. The property taxes keep increasing, and after last year's medical bills." Harold looked out the kitchen window toward the orchard, where the morning light illuminated the trees' red and gold bounty. How could he explain to his practical, city-raised daughter that Hillcrest wasn't just land and buildings, but the physical embodiment of his family's history, that the soil itself seemed to hold the memories of those who had worked it before him? "Mitchell men don't abandon their legacy," he said finally, quoting his father. "The farm stays in the family." Grace sighed, her frustration evident. "And what happens when you can't manage it anymore? When something breaks that you can't fix?" "When I'm managing fine," Harold interrupted, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. The property tax notice that had arrived yesterday lay hidden beneath a cookbook on the counter, its amount nearly double what he'd anticipated. The apple harvest, while plentiful, wouldn't cover even half the farm's expenses this year. Sensing the tension, Ethan surprisingly intervened. "Hey, Gramps, I saw on the news that the veterans shelter in town is having trouble. Something about funding cuts?" Harold nodded, grateful for the change of subject. "Federal budget cuts hit them hard. Elena Vasquez, she runs the place, told me they're having trouble feeding everyone. Number of homeless vets has doubled in the county since that factory closure in Riverdale." Grace's expression softened. She knew her father's dedication to veterans' causes stemmed from deep respect for his own father's service and the community's support when Thomas Mitchell had returned from Korea with injuries that had never fully healed. "That's why I'm taking the apple harvest to the shelter this year," Harold continued, looking at his daughter with quiet determination. "They need it more than the market needs another apple vendor." "The entire harvest?" Grace asked, alarmed. "Dad, that's your main fall income. How will you—" "Got enough saved for essentials," Harold said, though the property tax notice on the counter argued otherwise. "Veterans took care of this country. Least I can do is make sure they don't go hungry." Grace wanted to object further, but she recognized the set of her father's jaw, the same expression he'd worn when deciding to keep the farm running after her mother's death, despite everyone's concerns about him living alone. Instead, she reached across the table and covered his weathered hand with hers. "Mom would be proud of you. Just promise me you'll be careful with the finances. The farm won't help anyone if you lose it." Harold nodded, the closest he would come to acknowledging his precarious situation. They finished their pie in more comfortable conversation, Ethan surprising them both by asking questions about the apple varieties in the orchard. The boy had his mother's mind for details, Harold noted with pride, even if he hid it beneath teenage disinterest. When Grace and Ethan prepared to leave 2 hours later, Harold pressed a bag of apples into his grandson's hands. "For school lunches," he said. "Better than those mealy things from the supermarket." Ethan accepted the gift with unusual reverence. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Thanks, Gramps. Maybe I could come help with the harvest next weekend, if you're still picking, I mean." Harold's heart swelled at the unexpected offer. "Always room for another pair of hands at Hillcrest," he said, ruffling the boy's hair as he had when Ethan was small. After their car disappeared down the winding driveway, Harold returned to the kitchen and finally retrieved the property tax notice. The amount seemed to glare accusingly up at him, 8,742, 16, due by November 30th. Even in a good year, it would have been challenging. With his decision to donate the apple harvest rather than sell it, it became nearly impossible. He sank into his chair, Buddy resting his head on Harold's knee, as if sensing his master's distress. "What would you do, Thomas?" Harold asked aloud, looking up at the photograph of his father. The proud, uniformed figure in the frame offered no answer, but Harold already knew what his father would have said. The Mitchell family had always prioritized service to community over personal gain. With renewed resolve, Harold tucked the tax notice into his pocket and headed back to the orchard. The afternoon stretched before him, filled with apples to harvest, and a decision he would not allow himself to regret, whatever the consequences. The next morning dawned clear and cold, a crystalline October day that hinted strongly at winter's approach. Harold rose at his customary 5:30 a.m., his joints protesting more than usual as he moved through his morning routine. Coffee brewing, Buddy fed, weather forecast checked on the ancient radio that had belonged to his father. "Frost warning for Lakeside County tonight," the announcer informed his listening audience. "Temperatures expected to drop to the upper 20s. Farmers should take precautions with any sensitive crops still in the ground." Harold frowned at the news. An early frost meant he needed to complete the apple harvest today, not by the end of the week as he'd planned. Any fruit left on the trees could be damaged, reducing its value even for cider making. With a sense of urgency, he headed to the orchard after a hasty breakfast, hauling additional baskets from the barn. The morning passed in steady labor, Harold working methodically down the rows, selecting the finest fruit for the veterans' shelter and setting aside the less perfect specimens for processing into cider or preserves. By midday, his pickup truck was half filled with carefully packed crates of apples. His back ached fiercely and his fingers were stiff from hours of reaching and grasping, but Harold pushed on. Buddy remained close by, occasionally bringing his master a fallen apple as if to contribute to the effort. As Harold paused for a brief lunch, a simple sandwich eaten while sitting on an overturned crate, he noticed dark clouds gathering on the western horizon. The weather forecast hadn't mentioned rain, but Harold's bones told him differently. 60 years of farming had taught him to read the sky better than any meteorologist could. "Going to be a race, Buddy," he told the dog, packing away his lunch. "Weather's changing faster than they predicted." With renewed determination, Harold worked through the afternoon, ignoring the increasing pain in his lower back and the arthritic protest of his fingers. By 4 o'clock, his truck was filled to capacity with the finest apples Hillcrest Farm had produced in years. The threatening clouds had continued their advance, and the wind had taken on the damp chill that preceded rain. Harold surveyed the remaining trees with regret. Perhaps a quarter of the harvest remained unpicked, but his truck could hold no more, and his body had reached its limits. The unpicked fruit would have to take its chances with the frost. "Better get these delivered before the storm hits," he told Buddy, who jumped eagerly into the passenger seat of the truck, assuming correctly that he was invited on this journey. The drive to Pinecrest Veterans Shelter took 20 minutes. The truck laboring up the hills with its heavy load. The facility occupied a repurposed elementary school on the outskirts of town, its institutional brick facade softened somewhat by half-hearted landscaping. As Harold pulled into the nearly empty parking lot, he noticed several men sitting on benches near the entrance, their postures conveying a quiet resignation that made his heart ache. Harold parked near the main doors and climbed stiffly from the driver's seat. Before he could make his way to the building's entrance, one of the men approached, tall and straight-backed despite his apparent age, with close-cropped gray hair and the unmistakable bearing of career military. "Need a hand, sir?" the man asked, his voice carrying the natural authority of someone accustomed to command. "Wouldn't turn one down," Harold admitted, gesturing to the truck bed. "Got a delivery for the shelter." The man assessed the truck's contents with a quick, professional glance. "That's quite a lot of apples." "This year's harvest from Hillcrest Farm," Harold explained. "Heard the shelter was having trouble with supplies since the funding cuts." Something flickered in the man's eyes, surprise perhaps, or a deeper emotion Harold couldn't identify. "Sergeant Marcus Coleman," he introduced himself, extending a hand that bore the calluses of physical labor despite its impeccable cleanliness. "Harold Mitchell," Harold replied, shaking the offered hand. "Hillcrest has been in my family since 1922. Recognition dawned on Marcus's face. "Mitchell? Any relation to Thomas Mitchell, 38th Infantry Regiment?" Harold stared in astonishment. "My father served in Korea, 1951 to 53. The connection seemed to transform Marcus's already respectful demeanor into something approaching reverence. "Sir, my grandfather served in the same unit. Staff Sergeant William Coleman. He spoke of your father. Often said Thomas Mitchell saved his life at the Chosin Reservoir." The coincidence left Harold momentarily speechless. His father had rarely spoken of his war experiences, but the few stories he shared often mentioned a friend called Bill who had helped him survive the bitter Korean winter. Their conversation was interrupted by Elena Vasquez, the shelter's director, emerging from the building with a concerned expression that transformed to astonishment when she saw Harold's truck. "Mr. Mitchell," she called, approaching quickly. "What is all this?" "This year's apple harvest," Harold explained. "Thought your folks could use some fresh produce." Eleanor looked from the truck to Harold, her professional composure momentarily cracking. "Mr. Mitchell, this is incredibly generous, but it must be worth thousands of dollars. Are you certain?" "Already decided," Harold said firmly. "My father always said we need to take care of those who served. Weather report says frost tonight, so these needed picking anyway." More veterans had gathered, drawn by the unusual activity. Harold noticed how their expressions changed as they understood what was happening, shifting from the flat affect of those accustomed to disappointment to cautious hope. Among them, a younger man with a pronounced limp approached hesitantly. "Are those Honey Crisps?" he asked, eyeing the nearest crate with an almost childlike eagerness. "Some are," Harold confirmed. "Got Gallus, Jonagolds and Northern Spy too. Best eating apples in the county, if I do say so myself." The young man, later Harold would learn his name was Jimmy Turner, and he'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan before an IED took part of his leg, reached for an apple with an expression of wonder. "Haven't had a fresh apple since. Well, since before deployment. The stuff they serve here is canned most days." With Marcus taking charge of unloading, the veterans formed an efficient line, passing crates from the truck to the shelter's kitchen. Harold found himself working alongside men and women of various ages and backgrounds, united by their service and current circumstances. Despite his fatigue, he felt a growing sense of rightness about his decision. Elena invited him inside once the truck was empty, offering coffee in her small office while the kitchen staff excitedly planned meals around the unexpected bounty. The shelter's interior was clean but Spartan, its walls institutional beige, its furnishings clearly donated and mismatched. Yet Harold noticed touches of dignity, a perfectly maintained flag display, military branch insignias mounted with precision, a memorial wall honoring local veterans. "This donation will make an enormous difference," Elena said, handing Harold a steaming mug. "The budget cuts have forced us to reduce meals to bare minimums. Fresh fruit is a luxury we haven't been able to afford in months." Harold nodded, sipping his coffee. "Glad they'll be put to good use." He hesitated, then asked the question that had been forming since his arrival. "If you don't mind me asking, how many veterans are you housing currently?" 47 at present, Elena replied. "Another dozen on a waiting list. The factory closure in Riverdale hit many of our older vets hard. They lost jobs with no prospects for new employment at their age. The younger ones..." She glanced toward the doorway where Jimmy Turner passed by. "Many struggle with physical or psychological injuries that make civilian employment challenging." Harold listened, struck by the contrast between these men and women who had served their country and the circumstances in which they now found themselves. Before he could respond, Marcus appeared in the doorway. "Ms. Vasquez, we've stored the apples as you suggested. The kitchen staff is already preparing desserts for tonight." He turned to Harold with evident respect. "Mr. Mitchell, what you've done today, words aren't adequate." Harold waved away the praise, uncomfortable as always with gratitude. "Just apples. Would have been a shame to let the frost get them." Marcus studied him with perceptive eyes that seemed to see beyond Harold's modesty. "May I walk you to your truck? I'd like to hear more about your father, if you're willing to share." Outside, the first raindrops began to fall as dark clouds claimed the sky. Harold and Marcus walked slowly, the younger man unconsciously adapting his pace to accommodate Harold's stiffness. "My grandfather told me that during the retreat from Chosin, your father carried him for 2 miles through a snowstorm after shrapnel tore up his leg," Marcus said. "Said Thomas Mitchell was the strongest man he ever knew, in body and spirit." Harold nodded, memories of his father's rare stories surfacing. "Dad always said he couldn't have survived that winter without Bill Coleman sharing his extra socks. Said cold took more men than bullets did." They reached the truck where Buddy waited patiently, his tail thumping against the seat at their approach. The rain had intensified, drumming on the truck's roof and turning the parking lot into a patchwork of puddles. "Mr. Mitchell," Marcus said as Harold prepared to depart, "I noticed your orchard still has quite a few apples unpicked, with the frost coming." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Some of us here have agricultural experience. We'd be glad to help finish your harvest tomorrow, save what we can before the weather turns." The offer took Harold by surprise. His instinct was to decline, to insist he could manage on his own, as he had for years. But the ache in his back and the memory of the fruit still vulnerable on the trees made him reconsider. "That would be mighty helpful," he admitted finally. "The frost won't wait, and these old bones aren't what they used to be." Marcus nodded, a smile transforming his serious face. "We'll be there at sunrise, sir. That's a promise." As Harold drove home through the increasing rain, Buddy pressed against his side as if sensing his master's tumultuous thoughts. The property tax notice seemed to burn in his pocket, a problem no amount of neighborly help with the harvest could solve. Yet despite this looming financial threat, Harold felt a curious lightness. His father's connection to Marcus's grandfather seemed like a message from the past, an affirmation that some decisions transcended practical considerations. The rain turned to sleet as Harold turned onto the long driveway of Hillcrest Farm, the temperature dropping rapidly with the approaching night. The farmhouse windows were dark, emphasizing how alone he was in this place, built for a family. 4. The first time in years, Harold felt the true weight of his solitude as he prepared for bed, setting his alarm for dawn when Marcus and his fellow veterans would arrive. Outside, the promised frost began to form on the remaining apples in the orchard, crystallizing on their red and gold skins like nature's own tribute to their impending sacrifice. True to his word, Marcus Coleman arrived at Hillcrest Farm just as the first hints of dawn lightened the eastern sky. He wasn't alone. 3 pickup trucks followed his battered Jeep up the driveway, each carrying several veterans from the shelter. Harold, who had been awake since 4:30, watched their approach from the kitchen window, a mixture of gratitude and apprehension tightening his chest. He stepped onto the porch as the small convoy parked beside the barn, Buddy at his heels. Morning air was sharp with frost, vapor clouding from the mouths of the men and women who emerged from the vehicles. Harold counted 12 veterans in all, ranging from Jimmy Turner, who couldn't be more than 25, to an elderly woman who moved with the deliberate care of someone managing chronic pain. "Morning, Mr. Mitchell," Marcus called, approaching the porch. He was dressed for work in sturdy jeans and a heavy flannel jacket, a knit cap pulled low over his ears. "Hope we're not too early." "Right on time," Harold assured him, descending the steps. "Coffee's ready inside. Figured folks might need warming up before starting." The kitchen of Hillcrest Farm had never hosted so many people at once, not even during the family gatherings of Harold's youth. The veterans crowded around the large oak table and along the counters, grateful hands wrapped around steaming mugs. Harold had baked apple muffins at first light, and these disappeared with appreciative murmurs. As they ate, Marcus introduced each person, a gesture of respect that Harold deeply appreciated. Jimmy Turner had grown up on an Iowa apple farm before enlisting. Sarah Hernandez had been an agricultural specialist during her army service, teaching sustainable farming techniques in Afghanistan. Frank Washington had worked construction for 30 years after Vietnam, before arthritis ended his career. Each person had a story, each one currently residing at the shelter for different reasons, yet united by both service and circumstance. "Mr. Mitchell has about a quarter of his orchard still unharvested," Marcus explained, naturally assuming the role of coordinator. "Frost came earlier than expected. Our job is to salvage what we can today." Harold spread a hand-drawn map of the orchard on the table. "Eastern rows are Honeycrisps, still got about 15 trees untouched there. Northern section is mostly Golds, maybe 10 trees. Got ladders in the barn picking baskets too. Any apples with frost damage can go in the separate bins for cider making." The group nodded, absorbing the information with military efficiency. Harold couldn't help but notice how different their demeanor was from the resigned expressions he'd witnessed at the shelter. Here, with a clear mission and purpose, their postures had straightened, eyes alert, questions focused and practical. They moved to the orchard as the sun cleared the horizon, breath fogging in the crisp morning air. The frost had indeed affected some of the fruit, but less than Harold had feared. With 12 experienced workers plus himself, the remaining harvest wouldn't take more than a few hours. Harold found himself paired with Sarah Hernandez, the agricultural specialist. Her knowledge impressed him immediately. She identified apple varieties at a glance and handled the fruit with practiced care. "These trees are remarkably healthy for their age," she observed as they worked on a Honeycrisp near the eastern edge. "You don't use chemical pesticides?" Harold shook his head. "My father switched to organic methods back in the 60s, long before it was fashionable. Said chemicals might increase yield short-term, but damage the soil long-term. We use companion, Planting natural predators for pests works well enough. Sarah nodded appreciatively. Smart man, your father. The soil microbiome is everything. You can see the difference in the fruit quality. Throughout the orchard, similar conversations flowed as the veterans worked. Jimmy Turner and Marcus tackled the tallest trees, their younger legs handling the ladders with ease. Frank Washington organized the ground crew, his decades of managing construction sites evident in his calm, efficient direction. The elderly woman, who introduced herself simply as May, sat on a folding chair sorting apples with meticulous care, her gnarled fingers surprisingly nimble. By mid-morning, they had cleared half the remaining trees. Harold called a break, bringing out thermoses of hot cider and more muffins. As the group rested beneath the largest apple tree, a patriarch Harold's grandfather had planted, the conversation turned inevitably to the future of the farm. Place this size, with soil this good, could produce a lot more than just apples, Sarah commented, looking out over the rolling acres. You ever consider diversification, Mr. Mitchell? Harold sipped his cider thoughtfully. Thought about it. Over the years, Evelyn, that was my wife, she wanted to try berries, maybe a pumpkin patch for tourists. Never seemed to be enough hours in the day or dollars in the bank to expand. Agritourism can be lucrative, Jimmy offered. My uncle converted half his Iowa farm into a seasonal attraction. Corn maze, petting zoo, hay rides, makes more in 2 months of fall than a year of traditional crops. Takes infrastructure, Harold pointed out. Buildings, facilities, staff, things I don't have. Marcus had been listening quietly, his eyes moving thoughtfully over the property. You have good bones here, Mr. Mitchell. Solid foundation. Sometimes that's all you need to rebuild. There was something in his tone that caught Harold's attention, a hint of an idea forming. But before he could explore it further, the conversation shifted as Frank pointed out a storm system forming on the western horizon. Better get back to it, Harold said, rising with a slight wince as his joints protested. Weather's turning again. They returned to work with increased urgency, race against the approaching system. Harold found himself marveling at the veterans' efficiency, how naturally they divided tasks, anticipated needs, moved from problem to problem without wasted motion or effort. Their military training was evident not in rigid conformity, but in adaptable teamwork. By early afternoon, the final tree was cleared, its bounty carefully sorted and stored. What Harold had expected to take days was accomplished in hours, with twice the care he could have managed alone. The approaching storm clouds now loomed large on the horizon, but the harvest was secure. In the barn, Harold surveyed the results of their labor with quiet amazement. Crates of perfect eating apples stood neatly stacked alongside bins of slightly damaged fruit destined for cider or preserves. Not a single apple had been wasted. Don't know how to thank you, folks, Harold said as the group gathered before departing. Would have lost half to frost without your help. No thanks needed, Marcus replied. After what you did for the shelter, this was the least we could do. He hesitated, exchanging glances with several others in the group. Actually, Mr. Mitchell, we were hoping we might come back. There's more we could help with, if you're amenable. Harold looked at him quizzically. Harvest done. Not much else needs doing till spring. Sarah stepped forward. I noticed your irrigation system is outdated, wastes a lot of water. With some simple modifications, we could reduce your usage by 30% at least. Barn roof needs reinforcing. Before winter snows, Frank added. Notice some sagging in the northwest corner. Wouldn't take much to shore it up. Jimmy gestured toward the fallow fields beyond the orchard. That lower section by the creek, perfect for berry bushes. Soils, right, natural windbreak from those trees. We could help prepare it now for spring planting. One by one, the veterans offered observations and suggestions, each seeing potential in Hillcrest Farm that Harold, too close to his daily struggles, had ceased to recognize. Their enthusiasm was infectious, their expertise undeniable. Yet Harold hesitated, his pride warring with practicality. "Appreciate the offers," he said finally, "but can't ask you folks to work for free. You've got your own concerns." Marcus's expression turned serious. "Mr. Mitchell, may I speak plainly?" At Harold's nod, he continued, "Most of us at the shelter have skills, experience, knowledge. What we lack is purpose, opportunities to use what we know. Your farm, it could be more than just a place to work. It could be a place to rebuild." "What exactly are you proposing?" Harold asked, sensing something larger forming beneath the surface of this conversation. Marcus looked to Elena, who had arrived during the final hour of harvesting. To witness the collaboration, she stepped forward with a folder she'd brought from the shelter. "Mr. Mitchell, the Veterans Administration has a new program providing grants for therapeutic agricultural initiatives," she explained. "Farms that offer meaningful work experience and skills training for veterans transitioning to civilian life. The shelter has applied for funding, but we need a partner with established agricultural operations." Harold took the folder, leafing through the grant documents with growing understanding. "You're suggesting Hillcrest could be that partner?" It's more than just labor exchange," Elena continued. "The grant would fund infrastructure improvements, training programs, even stipends for participating veterans. Your experience and land combined with their skills and the federal funding could transform both the farm and the shelter's employment program." Harold sat heavily on a nearby crate, the implications overwhelming. "Farm's been in my family for 4 generations, never thought of it as anything but private operation." "It would remain yours," Marcus assured him quickly. "This wouldn't be a takeover, just a partnership. Your knowledge is as valuable as your land, more so in many ways." The veterans watched him respectfully, making no attempt to pressure his decision. In their faces, Harold saw not just hope, but something deeper, a reflection of the same connection to purpose that had sustained him through decades of working the land. The first drops of rain began to patter on the barn's metal roof as the approaching storm reached them. Harold looked out the open doors at his beloved farm, at the fields his grandfather had plowed, the trees his father had planted, the house where he'd raised his own family. For years, he'd seen only its decline, the slow slipping away of what had once been vibrant and productive. Now, through these strangers' eyes, he glimpsed what it could become again. "Don't need to decide today," Elena said gently. "The application deadline is still 3 weeks away. Take some time to think it over." Harold nodded, closing the folder carefully. "We'll do that. And regardless of what comes of this grant business, you folks are welcome back anytime. Farm could use your expertise, and I wouldn't mind the company." As the veterans prepared to leave, the rain intensified, drumming steadily on the roof and transforming the farm's dirt lanes into muddy tracks. Marcus lingered behind as the others dashed to their vehicles. "My grandfather told me something once about your father," he said quietly. "Said Thomas Mitchell understood that a farm isn't just land and crops, it's a living thing that needs community to truly thrive. Said the Mitchells always farmed with their hearts as much as their hands." He paused, meeting Harold's gaze directly. "Thought you might like to know that legacy continues." With that, he hurried through the rain to his waiting jeep, leaving Harold standing in the barn doorway, the folder clutched in his weathered hands, watching the departures with a curious mixture of emotions he couldn't quite name. That evening, as rain lashed against the windows of the farmhouse, Harold sat at the kitchen table with the grant proposal spread before him, Buddy dozing at his feet. The property tax notice lay alongside it, a stark reminder of the financial realities he faced. The proposal described a program that sounded almost too good to be true, infrastructure improvements funded by the grant. veterans receiving training and therapy through agricultural work, produce sales benefiting both the farm and the shelter. Hillcrest would become a working model of sustainable agriculture while serving those who had served their country. Harold found himself repeatedly drawn to a section describing the psychological benefits of agricultural work for veterans suffering from PTSD and other service-related challenges. The connection to land, the rhythms of growing things, the tangible results of labor. These elements offered healing that traditional therapy alone couldn't provide. He thought of Jimmy Turner's enthusiasm when describing his family's Iowa farm, of Sarah Hernandez's expert knowledge of soil health, of the dignity and purpose that had straightened Marcus Coleman's already military-perfect posture when discussing potential improvements to Hillcrest. The telephone rang, startling Harold from his contemplation. It was Grace, calling as she did every evening when she worked late shifts at the hospital. "How'd the apple picking go, Dad?" she asked after their usual greetings. Harold found himself describing the day's events with more animation than he'd felt in years, detailing the veterans' efficiency, their knowledge, the way they'd transformed what should have been a desperate race against frost into a community endeavor. "They actually want to come back," he concluded. "Got some idea about a partnership with the shelter, grant funding for veterans to work and train here." "That sounds interesting," Grace said cautiously. "What kind of partnership?" "Still, figuring that out myself," Harold admitted. "Got some paperwork to review, but these folks know their business, Grace. Not just about farming, but building, engineering, marketing, things I've never had time or money to explore." There was a brief silence on the line. "You sound different, Dad. Excited, almost." Harold realized with surprise that she was right. The weight of impending failure that had pressed on him for years had temporarily lifted, replaced by possibilities he hadn't allowed himself to consider. "Maybe I am," he acknowledged. "Been a while since the farm felt like anything but a burden. Today, seeing it through fresh eyes." He trailed off, unsure how to express the transformation in his perspective. "I'm glad," Grace said softly. "You know all I've ever wanted is for you to be happy, right? Whether that means keeping the farm or finding another path." "I know that, sweetheart." After ending the call, Harold returned to the grant proposal with renewed focus. The rain continued its steady percussion on the roof, a soothing backdrop to his thoughts. Buddy stirred occasionally at his feet, chasing dream rabbits with small twitches and soft whimpers. By midnight, Harold had read every word of the proposal 3 times, made pages of notes, and formulated a dozen questions. The practicalities remained daunting, the changes to his solitary routine potentially dramatic. Yet beneath these concerns ran a current of possibility that kept him from dismissing the idea outright. He rose stiffly from the table and moved to the window overlooking the orchard. The rain had passed, leaving behind a clearing sky where stars emerged between scudding clouds. The apple trees stood in shadowy rows, their harvest complete, their cycle fulfilled for another year. "What do you think, Evelyn?" he asked softly to the empty room, a habit he'd maintained in the years since her passing. "Our farm helping. Soldiers heal. Seems like something you'd approve of." No answer came, of course, but Harold felt a sense of rightness settle over him. The decision wasn't made. There were too many details to consider, too many questions to answer. But the possibility had taken root, much like the saplings his father had planted all those decades ago. Outside, the cleared sky allowed the temperature to drop rapidly. The first true hard freeze of autumn crept across Hillcrest Farm, crackling in puddles and stiffening the mud. But inside the old farmhouse, something new and fragile was beginning to warm and grow. 3 weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity that transformed Hillcrest Farm more dramatically than the changing season. Following Harold's decision to explore the partnership with the Veterans Shelter, A steady stream of skilled workers arrived daily, each bringing expertise that breathed new life into the aging property. Frank Washington and his construction team tackled the barn first, reinforcing the sagging roof and replacing rotted support beams with salvaged timber. Built things to last in those days, Frank observed admiringly as they uncovered the original oak framework Harold's grandfather had installed. Just needs a little respect to keep it standing another century. Sarah Hernandez mapped the outdated irrigation system, designing improvements that would reduce water consumption by nearly 40%. The creek's perfect for a gravity-fed system, she explained, sketching plans at Harold's kitchen table. With a small retention pond here, her pencil circled an area in the lower field, you could capture runoff during spring rains, carry you through late summer droughts without tapping the well. Jimmy Turner, whose family's Iowa farm had specialized in berry production, took soil samples from the unused eastern acres, his enthusiasm growing with each test result. Perfect pH for blueberries in this section, he reported. Raspberries would thrive along that southern slope, give you 2 harvest seasons beyond the apples, extend your income stream significantly. Each day brought new suggestions, new possibilities that Harold had never considered or had dismissed as beyond his solitary capabilities. The veterans worked with a sense of mission that inspired him, their military precision softened by genuine care for the land and its elderly caretaker. Most remarkable to Harold was the transformation in the veterans themselves. Men and women who had appeared defeated at the shelter stood taller here, their eyes clearer, their conversation more animated. Elena Vasquez visited regularly, observing this change with quiet satisfaction. We've tried traditional therapy programs for years, she confided to Harold as they watched a team clearing brush from the creek bed. Nothing seems to help like this. Purposeful work, connection to the land, visible results at day's end. Harold understood. The same elements had sustained him through Evelyn's long illness and death, through the gradual departure of neighbors as family farms succumbed to economic pressures, through the loneliness of aging in a culture that valued youth and speed above experience and patience. Land's got healing in it, he told Elena. My father called it growing therapy, said you can't stay broken when you're helping things grow. Marcus Coleman became a daily presence, arriving each morning before dawn to review the day's projects over coffee with Harold. Their conversations ranged widely: military history, agricultural techniques, weather forecasting, philosophy, revealing a man of remarkable intellect behind the sergeant's disciplined exterior. My grandfather died when I was 15, Marcus shared one morning as they watched the sunrise paint the orchard in gold. But he made sure I knew your father's story, how Thomas Mitchell had been a conscientious objector who served as a medic, refusing to carry a weapon but risking his life repeatedly to save others. Harold nodded, memories of his father's quiet integrity surfacing. Dad never talked much about career, said some experiences resist words, but he lived his values every day afterward: gentleness, service, stewardship of the land. Values worth preserving, Marcus observed, along with this farm. By the 3rd week, the grant application was nearly complete. The partnership framework, carefully structured to protect Harold's ownership while allowing for the Veterans Program to operate on the property. Elena had engaged a lawyer specializing in agricultural partnerships to ensure all parties' interests were protected. The VA Review Committee meets next Thursday, she informed Harold during her Friday visit. They've already expressed interest in our preliminary proposal. If approved, funding could be available by year-end. Harold received this news with cautious optimism. The grant would resolve his immediate financial crisis, providing funds for property taxes and essential improvements. More importantly, it would ensure Hillcrest Farm remained viable with a succession plan that kept the land productive rather than vulnerable to developers who had been eyeing the property for years. Yet doubts still surfaced in quiet moments. The transition from solitary farmer to partnership director represented a profound change in his relationship with the land his family had worked independently for generations. Would Thomas Mitchell have approved this new direction? Was Harold betraying the legacy of self-sufficient stewardship by accepting government funding and outside involvement? These questions weighed heavily as Harold drove into Pinecrest for his monthly visit to Palmer's hardware store. The small town had changed dramatically during his lifetime, its once vibrant main street now dotted with vacant storefronts as commerce shifted to big-box retailers in Riverdale. Palmer's remained one of the few original businesses stubbornly serving the community despite dwindling profits. "Harold Mitchell!" Clayton Palmer called from behind the counter as the bell above the door announced his arrival. "Man of the hour. Don't think I've seen you twice in 1 month since Evelyn was doing her garden expansions." Harold accepted Clayton's hearty handshake with mild confusion. "Need some plumbing supplies for the irrigation project. What's this man of the hour business?" Clayton gestured toward a copy of the Pinecrest Gazette on the counter. "Your front page news, my friend. Local farmer partners with veterans for innovative agricultural program. It got the whole town talking." Harold stared at the newspaper in astonishment. The article included a photograph he hadn't realized was taken, himself and Marcus examining apple trees, surrounded by working veterans. The headline declared, "Historic Hillcrest Farm to become Veterans Agricultural Training Center." "Ellen Watson from the Gazette came by last Tuesday," Harold recalled. "Asked a few questions about the farm's history. Never mentioned publishing anything." "No, well, she did," Clayton said, pushing the paper toward him. "And it's about time Pinecrest had some good news to report. Town's been dying by inches since the factory closed." Harold scanned the article with growing discomfort. While factually accurate in describing the potential partnership, the piece presented it as a done deal rather than a proposal under consideration. It quoted Mayor Chen praising the initiative as a model of rural economic development and veterans support that could revitalize our community. It mentioned the grant application and projected benefits, with none of the caution or contingencies Harold had emphasized in his brief interview. "It's premature," Harold muttered. "Grants not approved. Nothing's finalized." Clayton waved away his concern. "Details. Point is, you're bringing something positive to Pinecrest when we sorely need it. Veteran rehabilitation, agricultural preservation, job creation, trifecta of good news." Harold completed his purchase quickly, eager to escape the unexpected attention. As he loaded supplies into his truck, several passers-by called greetings, some referencing the article with enthusiastic approval. The public spotlight felt deeply uncomfortable to a man who had spent decades in the relative solitude of his farm. The drive home provided needed space for reflection. Harold had never sought recognition or community leadership. His father had been the one who served on agricultural boards and county commissions, who organized farmer cooperatives and championed rural preservation. Harold had preferred the quiet work of tending land and trees, maintaining rather than transforming. Now, without intending it, he found himself at the center of what the newspaper called a visionary initiative to address multiple community challenges. The responsibility felt overwhelming, well beyond the simple desire to save his family, farm and honor his commitment to veterans that had motivated his initial donation. As he turned onto the long driveway of Hillcrest Farm, Harold was surprised to find Grace's car parked beside the house. Sunday was her usual visiting day, not Friday. A flicker of concern crossed his mind. Had something happened to Ethan? He found his daughter at the kitchen table with the same newspaper he'd seen at Palmer's, her expression a complex mixture of surprise and concern. Dad, she began, without preamble, when you mentioned some idea about a partnership with the shelter, I didn't realize you were establishing a full-scale veterans training center. Harold set down his packages with a tired sigh. Newspaper got ahead of reality. Nothing's established yet. Still just a proposal, contingent on grant approval. Grace tapped the article. This makes it sound like a major operation. Training, programs, therapy services, agricultural production. They're talking about new buildings, staff positions. She looked up at him directly. Is this really what you want for the farm? For yourself? The question struck at the heart of Harold's own uncertainties. He moved to the window overlooking the orchard, where a team of veterans was installing the improved irrigation system under Sarah's direction. Their focused activity, the evident care they took with the land, the occasional laughter that drifted up to the house, all spoke to a vitality Hillcrest Farm hadn't known in years. What I want, Harold said slowly, is for this land to remain productive, for the Mitchell legacy to continue meaningfully, not just preserved like a museum piece. He turned to face his daughter. What I've learned these past weeks is that I can't do that alone anymore, not with these old bones and limited resources. Grace's expression softened. I understand that, Dad. I just worry about the scale of change. This sounds like turning our family farm into a public institution. Partnership, not surrender, Harold clarified. Farm remains in Mitchell hands. Veterans Program operates as tenant with collaborative rights. Hillcrest benefits from their labor and expertise, shelter benefits from training opportunities, and produce income. And you? Grace pressed. Where do you fit in this new arrangement? Article mentions you as program director and master, farmer instructor. Sounds like a full-time job, not retirement. Harold hadn't considered this aspect, how his daily life would change under the proposed structure. The title mentioned in the newspaper was Elena's suggestion, acknowledging his essential role while creating a position that could eventually transition to another experienced farmer when Harold could no longer manage. Wouldn't be doing much different than I do now, he said. Teaching what I know, overseeing operations, making decisions about the land, just with help, resources, purpose beyond mere survival. Grace studied him thoughtfully. You seem different, Dad. More energized. When you called about these veterans helping with the harvest, I didn't expect it would lead to all this. Neither did I, Harold admitted with a slight smile. Life takes unexpected turns. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Harold opened it to find Mayor Diana Chen on his porch, her official car parked behind Grace's. Her appearance was as unexpected as it was unprecedented. In all his years in Pinecrest, no mayor had ever visited Hillcrest Farm. Mr. Mitchell, she greeted him with professional warmth. I hope I'm not interrupting. I saw the article in the Gazette and wanted to personally express the town's support for your initiative with the Veterans Shelter. Harold invited her in with reflexive hospitality, making introductions to Grace. Mayor Chen accepted the offered coffee and seated herself at the kitchen table with the air of someone prepared for a substantial conversation. Pinecrest has been struggling since the factory closure, she began directly. Lost nearly 20% of our population, 30% of tax revenue. Counties considering consolidating services with Riverdale, which would essentially end our existence as an independent municipality. Harold nodded, familiar with the town's challenges, though he rarely engaged in local politics. Your partnership with the Veterans Program represents exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need, Mayor Chen continued. Agricultural sustainability, veteran rehabilitation, job creation, addressing multiple needs simultaneously with minimal public funding. Still just a proposal, Harold reminded her, echoing his earlier caution to Grace. Grants not approved. Nothing's finalized. The mayor's expression remained confident. I've spoken with Congressman Lewis. He sits on the Veterans Affairs Committee and has indicated strong support for the grant application. It's precisely the type of rural-focused initiative the current administration wants to showcase. This was news to Harold, who hadn't realized their modest proposal had attracted federal attention. "Never intended to become a showcase," he said, discomfort evident in his tone. Mayor Chen leaned forward, her expression earnest. "Mr. Mitchell, sometimes our personal decisions have broader impact than we anticipate. What you've started here could become a model for rural communities nationwide, demonstrating how traditional farming knowledge can combine with veterans' skills to address multiple societal challenges." The weight of these expectations settled heavily on Harold's shoulders. What had begun as a simple harvest donation, followed by a practical partnership to save his farm, now carried implications far beyond Hillcrest's boundaries. "Town Council would like to formally endorse your grant application," the mayor continued. "Additionally, we're prepared to offer tax incentives and streamlined permitting for any new facilities the program might require, within reason, of course." Grace intervened, sensing her father's overwhelm. "That's very generous, Mayor Chen. I'm sure my father appreciates the support, but perhaps these discussions should wait until the grant decision is finalized. There's still quite a bit of uncertainty." The mayor nodded, diplomatic enough to recognize the gentle deflection. "Of course, I simply wanted Mr. Mitchell to know the town stands ready to assist when needed. This partnership represents hope for Pinecrest at a time when we desperately need it." After Mayor Chen's departure, Harold and Grace sat in thoughtful silence. Through the window, they could see Marcus arriving in his jeep, likely bringing the afternoon crew to continue work on the irrigation system. "It's grown beyond you, hasn't it?" Grace observed gently. "This idea that started with an apple donation has taken on a life of its own." Harold nodded, watching as Marcus greeted the veterans already working in the orchard, his leadership evident in their respectful responses. "Life's like that sometimes. Plant a seed, never quite know what'll grow." Grace covered her father's weathered hand with her own. "Are you sure you're ready for this, Dad? All these expectations, responsibilities?" Harold considered the question seriously. At 78, most of his contemporaries had long since retired, their days filled with grandchildren, hobbies, or the quiet rhythms of advanced age. The path opening before him promised nothing quiet or simple, rather a complex collaboration requiring energy, adaptability, and vision. Yet in the 3 weeks since the veterans had entered his life, Harold had felt more purposeful than he had in years. The property tax notice that had seemed a death sentence for Hillcrest now represented merely a challenging deadline rather than an insurmountable obstacle. The physical limitations that had increasingly restricted his farming activities were offset by willing hands guided by his knowledge. "Not sure ready is the right word," he told Grace finally, "but willing, yes. Farm needs this. Veterans need this." He paused, acknowledging a truth he'd been reluctant to admit. "I need this." Grace's eyes filled with unexpected tears. "I've been so worried about you out here alone, struggling with this place, trying to convince you to sell, move closer to us in Riverdale." She shook her head ruefully. "Should have known better. Mitchells don't abandon their legacy, right?" Harold smiled at hearing his father's words from his daughter's lips. "Legacy isn't just keeping ownership. It's ensuring the land remains productive, beneficial. Your grandfather understood that when he switched to organic methods before anyone had heard the term. Your mother understood it when she started the first farm-to-school program in the county. Through the window, they watched as Jimmy Turner demonstrated proper pruning techniques to 2 younger veterans, his injured leg seeming no impediment to his skilled movements among the apple trees. Further down the slope, Sarah Hernandez was mapping the Berryfield section she'd proposed, her agricultural expertise evident in her methodical approach. "They know what they're doing," Grace acknowledged, following Harold's gaze. "And they clearly respect the land." "Respect goes deeper than that," Harold said. "They understand what it means to serve something larger than themselves. Military taught them that. Now they're applying that principle to the land instead of national defense." A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only when Buddy rose from his nap by the stove and padded to the door, signaling his desire for afternoon exercise. Harold rose to accommodate him, his joints protesting after the long drive to town and emotional conversations. "Want company on your walk?" Grace offered, recognizing her father's need for movement and fresh air. They strolled together down the lane toward the orchard, Buddy ranging ahead to investigate interesting scents. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rolling acres of Hillcrest Farm, highlighting the timeless beauty of land that had sustained 4 generations of Mitchells. As they approached the veterans working on the irrigation system, Marcus detached himself from the group and came to meet them. He greeted Grace with respectful courtesy before addressing Harold. "Mr. Mitchell, we've completed the main line connection to the creek. Sarah's design is working perfectly. Water pressure's excellent, distribution points all functioning. System should be fully operational by tomorrow afternoon." Harold nodded his approval. "Ahead of schedule as usual. You folks, don't waste time." "Military efficiency," Marcus replied with a slight smile, "and meaningful work is its own motivation." Grace observed their interaction with interest, noting the natural rapport between her father and this former sergeant. There was a balance of respect there, neither man attempting to dominate or dismiss the other despite their different backgrounds and experiences. "Ms. Hernandez wanted your input on the Berryfield layout when you have a moment," Marcus continued, "and Frank's team has a question about the barn's western foundation. Thinks there might be some settling issues worth addressing before winter." "I'll head over there now," Harold said. He turned to Grace. "Coming along?" She shook her head. "Think I'll let you handle the farm business. I should get back to Riverdale before dinner." She hesitated, then added, "But I'd like to bring Ethan tomorrow if that's okay. He mentioned wanting to see what's happening here. Maybe he could help with something." Harold's expression brightened at the mention of his grandson. "Boy's always welcome. Could use his young eyes for the computer work on the grant proposal. Elena brought over some fancy laptop none of us old folks can properly operate." After Grace's departure, Harold spent the remainder of the afternoon moving between project sites, offering guidance drawn from decades of experience with Hillcrest's particular challenges. The veterans received his input with genuine appreciation, integrating his suggestions while continuing to apply their own expertise. By sunset, the day's work complete, Harold invited the remaining veterans to join him for a simple supper in the farmhouse kitchen. This had become something of a tradition over the past weeks, a shared meal before they returned to the shelter, characterized by comfortable conversation and growing camaraderie. As Harold served his grandmother's apple cobbler recipe for dessert, Jimmy Turner raised a topic that had apparently been discussed among the veterans. "Mr. Mitchell," he began somewhat hesitantly, "we've been thinking about the shelter's constraints. Place is overcrowded, institutional, not really conducive to recovery. Some of us were wondering if the partnership moves forward, whether a few of us might eventually live here on the farm instead. Nothing fancy, maybe convert part of the barn into bunkhouse-style quarters. Would make the early morning work more practical and frankly being closer to the land." He trailed off, seeming uncertain how to express the full depth of his meaning. Harold considered the suggestion carefully. The farmhouse had 5 bedrooms, 4 of them unused since his children had moved away and Evelyn had passed. The barn's upper level, once used for hay storage before modern baling methods, offered substantial space that could be converted with relatively modest investment. More significantly, having veterans living on site would address his daughter's ongoing concern about him living alone at his age. While he'd resisted her suggestions of hired assistants or companions, the presence of capable people with a vested interest in the farm's success represented a different proposition entirely. Barn conversion would take some doing, Harold said, thoughtfully. Need proper insulation, plumbing, electrical work, grant cover, that sort of thing? Marcus nodded. Housing for program participants is specifically included in the funding guidelines. We've discussed it with Elena. Preliminary budget allows for modest accommodations for up to 6 veterans in the initial phase. Harold absorbed this information, realizing once again how thoroughly they had considered aspects of the partnership he hadn't yet contemplated. These people weren't making impulsive suggestions. They were presenting carefully researched proposals that addressed multiple needs simultaneously. Wouldn't mind the company, Harold admitted finally. House gets mighty quiet sometimes. Buddy's a good listener, but doesn't contribute much to conversation. The dog, hearing his name, thumped his tail against the floor from his position near the stove. Jimmy's face lit with barely contained hope. So you'd consider it for real? More than consider it, Harold decided. Makes good practical sense. Farm needs constant attention. Emergencies don't respect commuting schedules, and truth be told. He paused, acknowledging a vulnerability he rarely expressed. Gets harder each year managing alone. The relief and gratitude on the veterans' faces confirmed Harold's growing understanding of what Hillcrest Farm represented to them. Not just employment or training, but a place of belonging, purpose, and healing. The transformation he'd witnessed in them over mere weeks suggested what might be possible through longer-term engagement with the land. As darkness settled over Hillcrest Farm, Harold walked the veterans to their vehicles, Buddy accompanying them down the long driveway. The evening air carried the first true chill of advancing autumn, causing them to turn up collars and quicken their pace. Mitchell men don't abandon their legacy. His father's words echoed in Harold's mind as he watched the departures. Thomas. Mitchell could never have envisioned this particular evolution of the family farm, yet Harold suspected he would have approved of its essence. Land remaining productive while serving those who had served their country. The newspaper article's characterization of Hillcrest as a visionary initiative still felt uncomfortably grandiose. Harold harbored no illusions of visionary status. He was simply a man making practical decisions to preserve what mattered while adapting to changing circumstances. Yet standing alone in the gathering darkness, watching the veterans' taillights disappear down the rural road toward Pinecrest, Harold recognized that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the simplest actions. His decision to donate apples rather than sell them had opened a door he hadn't known existed, leading to possibilities that might ensure Hillcrest Farm's survival long after his stewardship ended. Buddy pressed against his leg, sensing the emotional currents in his master's stillness. Harold reached down to stroke the aging retriever's head, finding comfort in the dog's steady presence amid so much transformation. "Come on, old friend," he murmured. "Tomorrow's coming whether we're ready or not." Together they walked back, toward the farmhouse, its windows glowing with welcoming light against the darkness, a beacon of continuity amid change, much like Hillcrest Farm itself. On the eve of the Grant decision, an unseasonable storm rolled across Lakeside County with unexpected fury. Harold stood at the kitchen window, watching lightning illuminate the countryside in stark flashes, the rumble of thunder following seconds later. The meteorologists had predicted nothing more than light showers, but Harold's aching joints had told him differently. 60 years of farming had taught him to read the skies better than any weather service. "Going to be a rough night, buddy," he murmured to the retriever pressed anxiously against his leg. The dog, like many of his breed, harbored a deep fear of thunderstorms. Harold's concern wasn't for himself. The farmhouse had weathered a century of Midwest storms, but for the newly installed irrigation system in the eastern fields. Sarah Hernandez and her team had completed the project just yesterday. The trenches, still fresh and vulnerable to the kind of heavy rain now pounding against the roof. Should check on it, he decided, reaching for his weathered raincoat and hat. The telephone rang before he could step outside, Grace's number appearing on the caller ID. Harold hesitated, then answered. "Dad, are you watching the weather reports?" Grace's voice carried clear worry. "They've upgraded to a flash flood warning for Silver Creek, your eastern fields." "Just heading out to check the irrigation channels," Harold interrupted. "Not my first flood watch, Grace. Dad, please." Her voice took on the firm tone she reserved for serious matters. The county emergency management issued evacuation orders for all properties along Silver Creek below the Marshall Bridge. That includes your eastern acreage. Harold moved to the window again, squinting through the rain-lashed darkness toward the barely visible outline of his eastern fields. Silver Creek, normally a gentle stream that meandered along the properties. Boundary had been a consistent friend to Hillcrest Farm, providing reliable irrigation during dry seasons. But like any friend, it had its temperamental moments. "Creek's been high before," Harold said, though a flicker of concern had ignited. "Flood of '87 didn't quite reach the main fields." "This is different," Grace insisted. "Marshall Dam upstream is showing stress points. They're releasing pressure now, which means a surge is heading your way. The emergency alert says expected crest 3 feet higher than '87. That got Harold's attention. The flood of '87 had stopped just short of the farmhouse's foundation, sparing the main structure while saturating the lower fields. 3 feet higher would put water well into the first floor of his home. A sharp knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Harold opened it to find Marcus Coleman standing on the porch, rain dripping from his military-issue poncho, his expression grave. "Mr. Mitchell, we need to evacuate," he said without preamble. "I've got veterans mobilizing at the shelter to help secure what we can, but you need to get to higher ground immediately." Harold stood his ground. "Not leaving my farm to flood, without doing what I can." Marcus's expression showed he'd anticipated this response. "Sir, with respect, that's why I'm here early. We have exactly 43 minutes before the creek crests, according to county emergency services. That's enough. Time to secure valuables and essential documents, but only if we start now." Grace's voice emerged from the phone, still in Harold's hand. "Dad, is that Marcus? Thank God. Dad, please listen to him." The urgency in both their voices finally penetrated Harold's stubborn resistance. He'd lived through enough emergencies to recognize when professional concern transcended ordinary caution. "What about Buddy?" he asked, looking down at the trembling retriever. "He comes with us, of course," Marcus said, his tone softening slightly. "Elena's set up an emergency shelter at the community center. They're pet-friendly." What followed was a methodical evacuation that revealed Marcus's military training. He directed Harold to gather essential medications, important documents, and irreplaceable family mementos, while he himself moved efficiently through the house, elevating electronic equipment and securing larger furniture that might become dangerous in moving water. Harold focused on the family Bible containing generations of Mitchell history, the original farm deed, his father's military service records, and the small box of letters Evelyn had written him during their brief separations. These treasures went into waterproof containers Marcus had brought specifically for this purpose. As they worked, more vehicles arrived, Jimmy Turner and 3 other veterans who immediately began implementing what was clearly a prearranged flood response. Two headed for the barn to move equipment to higher ground, while Jimmy began sandbagging critical areas around the farmhouse foundation. "You planned for this," Harold observed, watching their coordinated efforts with growing appreciation. Marcus nodded. "Standard emergency preparedness. Elena insisted we develop contingency plans for all program sites. Flood protocol for Hillcrest Farm was top priority given the creek proximity." For perhaps the first time, Harold fully appreciated what the veterans' training and experience offered beyond agricultural skills. Disciplined crisis management shaped by military service that had prepared them to respond effectively when ordinary citizens might panic. Within 30 minutes, they had secured what they could. The eastern fields with their newly installed irrigation system would undoubtedly suffer damage, but the primary structures and equipment had been protected as much as possible given the limited time. "Mr. Mitchell, we need to go now," Marcus said firmly, checking his watch. "Creek's going to crest in approximately 12 minutes. Harold took a final look around the kitchen, heart of the home his grandfather had built, where 4 generations of Mitchells had gathered for meals, celebrations, and difficult conversations. Water damage could be repaired, he reminded himself. Structures rebuilt, land restored. The Mitchell legacy resided in more than wood and soil. "Let's go," he said finally, whistling for Buddy, who appeared instantly at his side. The drive to Pinecrest Community Center took place through worsening conditions, windshield wipers barely keeping pace with the deluge. Harold sat silently in Marcus's Jeep. Buddy pressed against him in the back seat, watching familiar landmarks disappear behind curtains of rain. Jimmy Turner and the other veterans followed in their trucks, the small convoy moving steadily toward higher ground. The community center parking lot was already filling with evacuees when they arrived. Elena Vasquez stood under the covered entrance, clipboard in hand, directing people to appropriate areas inside. Her expression registered visible relief when she spotted Harold emerging from Marcus's vehicle. "Mr. Mitchell," she called, hurrying. "Over with an umbrella. We've got a comfortable area set up for you and Buddy inside." Grace called. "She's on her way from Riverdale, but the highway's partially flooded. She'll meet you here when she can get through." The efficiency of the operation impressed Harold as he was escorted inside. The gymnasium had been transformed into an orderly evacuation center with designated areas for families, elderly residents, those with medical needs, and pet owners. Tables offered hot coffee and simple meals, while volunteers circulated providing information and emotional support. Harold recognized many faces from Pinecrest, the hardware store owner, the postal clerk, neighbors from farms adjacent to Hillcrest. Natural disasters erased social boundaries, creating temporary communities united by shared vulnerability. Elena guided him to a quiet corner where a recliner had been placed alongside several chairs. "Thought you might be more comfortable here," she explained. "It's where we've set up for our older evacuees." Harold would normally have bristled at such accommodation for his age, but exhaustion and concern had temporarily dampened his pride. He sank into the recliner gratefully, Buddy settling at his feet with a heavy sigh. "The veterans' shelter?" Harold asked, suddenly realizing the implications of the flood for the facility housing the program participants. "Evacuation was completed an hour ago," Elena assured him. "The shelter sits lower than Hillcrest. They were in the first zone, ordered to evacuate. Everyone's accounted for and safe." For the next several hours, Harold alternated between fitful dozing and anxious wakefulness. Updates arrived sporadically as emergency services reported creek levels and damage assessments. Silver Creek had indeed crested higher than the historic flood of '87, inundating low-lying areas throughout the county. Just after midnight, Marcus appeared with 2 cups of coffee, offering one to Harold. "Thought you might want this, and an update." Harold accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. "Hillcrest? Eastern fields are completely underwater." Marcus confirmed. Irrigation system we installed is likely compromised. Barn has water approximately 2 feet high on the ground floor based on emergency services drive-by assessment. And the house. Marcus hesitated. Water is reported at porch level and rising. First floor almost certainly taking on water. Harold absorbed this information with outward calm, though his heart constricted painfully. The farmhouse had never flooded in living memory, not during the Mitchell family's tenure. His grandfather had deliberately positioned it on the property's highest point, a decision vindicated through decades of seasonal creek fluctuations. "Our creek's never risen this high," he said quietly. "Not in 100 years." "Climate patterns are changing," Marcus replied simply. "What was once in a century is becoming once in a decade. Military's been preparing for these shifts for years. It's why we developed agricultural resilience programs in vulnerable regions overseas." Harold nodded, remembering Sarah Hernandez mentioning her work with drought-resistant farming techniques in Afghanistan, adaptations to changing climate conditions that had seemed distant from Hillcrest's concerns until now. "Grant Committee meets tomorrow," Harold noted, the timing suddenly striking him as particularly cruel. "Doubt they'll want to fund a program on flooded farmland." Marcus studied him thoughtfully. "Don't underestimate the VA's commitment to this initiative, Mr. Mitchell. They understand adaptation and resilience better than most government agencies. This situation might actually strengthen our application, demonstrating the need for climate-adaptive agricultural training for veterans." Before Harold could respond, a commotion at the entrance drew their attention. Grace had finally arrived, her clothes damp despite an umbrella, her expression shifting from anxiety to relief as she spotted her father. "Dad!" she called, hurrying across the gymnasium. "Thank God you're safe." Their reunion was brief but emotional, Grace checking him over with the hybrid concern of daughter and medical professional before settling into the chair beside his recliner. Buddy received equal attention, the dog's spirits visibly lifting at Grace's familiar presence. "Have you heard about the farm?" she asked tentatively. Harold nodded. "Eastern fields gone, barn partially flooded, house taking water on the first floor." Grace covered his hand with hers. "I'm so sorry, Dad. After all the progress with the Veterans Program, this feels especially unfair." "Farms survived worse," Harold replied, though without his usual conviction. In truth, this flood represented potentially catastrophic damage to Hillcrest's infrastructure, just when renewal had seemed possible through the partnership with the Veterans Program. Dawn arrived with weakening rain and reports that Silver Creek had begun to recede, though flooding remained severe throughout the county. Emergency management officials announced that evacuees should prepare for at least another day away from their properties, while damage assessments continued. Harold had just finished a sparse breakfast when Mayor Chen appeared at the community center, her normally impeccable appearance showing signs of a sleepless night, managing the town's crisis response. She headed directly for his corner after a brief consultation with Elena. "Mr. Mitchell," she greeted him, fatigue evident in her voice. "I wanted to update you personally on the county's emergency response plans. Hillcrest Farm is in Sector 3 for recovery operations, which means assessment teams should reach your property by early afternoon." "Appreciate the information," Harold replied. "Any preliminary reports on overall damage?" The mayor's expression was grave. "Significant agricultural impact countywide. Marshall Dam sustained structural damage. Engineers are on site now. Several bridges washed out, including the County Road 17 crossing near your property." This was unwelcome news. County Road 17 provided the primary access to Hillcrest's eastern fields. Without that bridge, reaching the most vulnerable sections of his farm would require a 5-mile detour. Their conversation was interrupted by an unexpected arrival, Congressman Lewis, who had been scheduled to attend the Grant Committee meeting later that day. He approached their corner with Eleanor and Marcus close behind. "Mr. Mitchell," the congressman greeted him, extending his hand. "I came as soon as I heard Hillcrest was in the flood zone. The Veterans Agricultural Initiative is a priority for my office, and I wanted to assess the situation personally." Harold shook the offered hand with reflexive politeness, though he was surprised by the congressman's direct involvement. Political attention rarely focused on individual farms, even during natural disasters. "Appreciate your concern," he said cautiously, "but there must be more pressing matters requiring your attention during this emergency." Congressman Lewis shook his head. "I've just come from a briefing with emergency management. The floods. Impact is substantial, but not catastrophic for most of the county. However, for properties like Hillcrest that represent both historical significance and future program potential, specialized recovery support is warranted." The congressman turned to Elena. "The VA Grant Committee has been briefed on the situation. They've authorized an emergency advance of funds specifically for flood recovery efforts at Hillcrest Farm, contingent on the full application being approved next week." Elena's expression brightened considerably. "That's unprecedented. The committee hasn't even officially reviewed our proposal yet. Ooh, let's just say compelling preliminary materials and extraordinary circumstances have accelerated the process," the congressman replied with a tight smile. "The committee recognizes that immediate intervention could prevent long-term damage to a potential program site." Ooh. Harold listened to this exchange with mixed emotions. The offered assistance was both desperately needed and uncomfortably close to special treatment. His independent nature resisted being singled out when so many in the county had suffered similar damage. "Other farms in the flood zone need help too," he observed, "some without my resources or connections." The congressman nodded, seeming to appreciate Harold's concern. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Mitchell, which is why I'm proposing that Hillcrest Farm serve as a pilot recovery site, demonstrating how veterans' agricultural training programs can incorporate disaster resilience techniques that benefit the broader farming community." Marcus stepped forward. "Sir, if I may, my team includes veterans with specific expertise in flood recovery and soil remediation. With your permission, we could document our work at Hillcrest, creating protocols that could be shared with neighboring farms." The proposal was skillfully framed to address Harold's concern about preferential treatment while advancing the veterans' program objectives. Rather than merely benefiting from special assistance, Hillcrest would become a demonstration site for techniques that could help others, transforming personal recovery into community service. Before Harold could respond, Jimmy Turner arrived with several other veterans, their expressions reflecting both exhaustion and determination. "Assessment teams are headed out to the first sector," Jimmy reported. "We've volunteered to join the Hillcrest inspection once Sector 3 opens up. Sarah's particularly concerned about soil contamination in the eastern fields. Says we need to test runoff patterns before planning remediation." Harold was struck once again by how thoroughly these veterans had embraced Hillcrest's welfare, bringing specialized knowledge and proactive planning to challenges he would have faced alone just weeks earlier. "Field contamination?" he asked, concern deepening. Flooding often carried industrial pollutants and agricultural chemicals from upstream properties, potentially leaving hazardous residue as waters receded. Sarah Hernandez, who had appeared behind Jimmy, nodded grimly. "Marshall Industrial Park sits upstream from your eastern fields. State Environmental Protection has warned about potential chemical release from their holding ponds. We'll need comprehensive soil testing before making recovery decisions." The complexity of modern flood recovery suddenly overwhelmed Harold. In his father's day, flooding meant simply waiting for waters to recede, then replanting. Now it involved environmental testing, contamination protocols, insurance documentation, and federal assistance applications. Bureaucratic labyrinths he was ill-equipped to navigate alone. As if sensing his thoughts, Marcus spoke quietly. "This is where the partnership truly demonstrates its value, Mr. Mitchell. Our team includes environmental specialists, construction experts, and veterans trained in disaster recovery operations. What might take months for an individual farmer can be addressed in weeks with coordinated teams." Harold looked around at the circle that had formed around his chair, Grace watching him with concern, Elena and the congressman waiting for his response, Marcus and the veterans ready to implement recovery plans. The distance traveled from his solitary apple donation to this moment of communal purpose struck him with sudden clarity. "Seems Hillcrest Farm has found itself some reinforcements," he said finally. "Reckon we should put them to work." Vidal, relief in Grace's expression was immediate. She had clearly feared his pride might reject the offered assistance, maintaining the solitary struggle that had characterized his recent years at Hillcrest. As plans formed around him, assessment teams organized, recovery priorities established, resources allocated, Harold found himself experiencing an unexpected emotion amid the crisis. Hope. Not the fragile hope of temporary reprieve that had accompanied the initial discussions about the Veterans Program, but something more substantial. The flood that might have ended Hillcrest Farm's viability was instead revealing the full potential of the partnership, bringing together Harold's generational knowledge of the land with the veterans' specialized skills forged through military service. This combination offered something neither could achieve alone: resilience. By mid-afternoon, waters had receded enough for the first assessment teams to reach Hillcrest Farm. Harold insisted on joining them, despite Grace's concern about his stamina. Marcus arranged transportation in his high-clearance Jeep, carefully navigating still-flooded sections of rural roads. The approach to Hillcrest revealed the flood's impact gradually. Debris lines marked water levels on trees and fence posts, showing the extraordinary height the creek had reached. Fields that should have been preparing for winter dormancy now lay buried beneath layers of silt and scattered debris. When the farmhouse came into view, Harold steeled himself for devastating damage. The white, clapboard structure had stood as Hillcrest's heart for a century, unchanged in its essential character despite modernization of its systems. The thought of its ruination struck deeper than mere property damage. What he saw instead stopped him mid-breath. A team of nearly 20 veterans formed a human chain from the farmhouse porch to higher ground, carefully passing furniture, books, photo albums, and personal belongings to a dry staging area where items were being documented and protected. "When did they?" Harold began, turning to Marcus in confusion. Elena mobilized volunteers from the shelter as soon as waters began receding, Marcus explained. First response team reached Hillcrest about 3 hours ago. Their priority was salvaging irreplaceable personal items from the first floor. The disciplined efficiency of the operation was remarkable. Veterans worked with methodical care, each seeming to understand their role within the larger effort. Some carefully removed family photographs from water-damaged frames, laying them to dry on improvised racks. Others gently carried furniture to dry ground, where temporary tarps had been erected as shelter. "The Mitchell legacy," Marcus said quietly. "That's what they're preserving first. The physical infrastructure can be repaired, but family history, once lost, can't be recovered." Harold stepped from the Jeep, his presence immediately noted by the working veterans. Several called greetings, but continued their tasks without interruption, understanding the urgency of their mission. Frank Washington approached, wiping muddied hands on his already soiled pants. "Water reached about 3 feet inside on the ground floor," he reported without preamble. "Structural integrity looks sound. Your grandfather built this place to last. Main concern is electrical systems and potential mold development." "Barn?" Harold asked, glancing toward the structure partially visible through the trees. "Waters receded to about ankle level inside. We've got pumps working now. Equipment you had stored there is mostly salvageable. Marcus had us elevate the critical pieces yesterday before evacuation." The assessment continued methodically as Harold toured his property, veteran specialists reporting damage evaluations and immediate remediation steps already underway. The eastern fields had suffered as expected, with the newly installed irrigation system requiring extensive repairs. Yet even here, recovery teams were already mapping intervention strategies, identifying priorities for soil testing and debris removal. As the afternoon progressed, more vehicles arrived, residents from Pinecrest bringing food for the workers, additional volunteers offering assistance, local media documenting the community response. Harold's initial discomfort with attention had faded beneath gratitude for the overwhelming support. By sunset, temporary generators had restored limited power to the farmhouse, pumps had removed standing water from the barn, and a preliminary recovery plan had been established for each damaged area of Hillcrest. The veterans had demonstrated skills Harold hadn't known they possessed: crisis management, structural assessment, environmental remediation, documentation procedures for insurance and federal assistance. "We'll have teams rotating through continuously for the next several days," Elena explained as they gathered for a brief coordination meeting. "The VA has approved emergency stipends for veterans participating in the recovery effort, classifying it as practical training for the agricultural program." "Housing for everyone?" Harold asked, aware that both the shelter and many veterans' temporary accommodations in Pinecrest had been affected by the flood. "Mayor Chen has arranged dormitory space at the high school," Elena assured him. "It's basic but functional." As darkness settled over Hillcrest Farm, most workers departed for the temporary shelter, leaving a small security team to monitor pumps and generators overnight. Harold stood on the muddy driveway watching the departing vehicles, the scene illuminated by emergency floodlights powered by portable generators. Grace approached, having spent the day helping coordinate medical support for the recovery teams. "Dad, we should head back to the community center. There's nothing more to do tonight." Harold shook his head slowly. "You go on. Think I'll stay here?" "Dad, the house isn't habitable yet. No electricity except the generators, no safe water, potential contamination." "Got a cot set up in the barn loft," Harold interrupted gently. "Frank's team cleared it this afternoon. Perfectly dry up there. Marcus is staying too, and 4 others. Buddy and I will be fine." Grace studied him with concern. "You sure about this? You've had a long day." "Need to be here," Harold said. "Simply, farm's still standing. Mitchell's should be standing with it." Understanding softened her expression. "I'll bring fresh clothes and your prescription medications in the morning." After Grace departed, Harold walked slowly toward the barn, where temporary quarters had been established in the undamaged loft. Marcus fell into step beside him, respecting his silence while providing unobtrusive company. "Quite a day," Harold said finally as they reached the barn entrance. Marcus nodded. "First day of recovery is always the hardest. Seeing the full scope of damage, beginning to comprehend the work ahead, gets better from here." Harold glanced back toward the farmhouse, its familiar silhouette altered by flood debris and temporary lighting. "Never thought I'd see Hillcrest like this. Yet somehow, it seems more alive than it has in years. Adversity reveals character, in people and in places," Marcus observed. "What's emerging today isn't just about damage, but about resilience. The farm has good bones, as we say in construction, and now it has committed allies." As they climbed the stairs to the loft where simple cots had been arranged, Buddy following dutifully behind, Harold found himself reflecting on the day's revelations. The flood that might have ended Hillcrest Farm's viability had instead confirmed the vital importance of the veterans' partnership. What would have been an insurmountable disaster faced alone had become a manageable challenge faced together. "Mitchell men don't abandon their legacy," Harold murmured, quoting his father as he had so often during difficult times. "And now that legacy has expanded," Marcus added quietly, "to include those who understand what it means to serve something greater than themselves." Outside, Silver Creek continued its gradual retreat from Hillcrest's fields, leaving behind mud and debris, but also possibility. The land would recover as it always had. The difference now was that its caretaker would not face that recovery alone. Harold settled onto his cot, Buddy curling beside it with a contented sigh despite their unusual accommodations. Through the loft window, stars had begun to appear as clouds finally dispersed. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more decisions, more hard work. But for tonight, the simple knowledge that Hillcrest Farm endured, altered but undefeated, was enough. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.